let's pass the floor on to Ulrich from Atene KOM, and Ulrich is the head of cybersecurity there. And he's been our great friend, and he has participated in these events many times. And obviously, it's always interesting to hear from Ulrich, because Germany, I think, is far ahead of everyone else in terms of providing communication services. When it comes to railways as well, and Telecom was involved in this, and I think you know Ulrich can say a few words about the entire process and how they went about building this network. What were some of the shortfalls, and what are some of the lessons for Ukraine to learn, and what are some of the gaps that we need to be mindful of, and things just to think about before we even begin this process. Ulrich, over to you.
Thank you, Lilian. As always, great pleasure being with you. This series of events is coming to an end, as I understand. You're wrapping it up. I'm happy to comply with yet another request for helping you understand what's been going on over here, to draw your conclusions for your own purposes. Let me just briefly say that we're not always an example to follow. There's much that has been done here that had its shortcomings. In the case of mobile coverage, I think we have an international reputation for not being the brightest in setting up neither the technology nor the extension of the networks in a way that really provided coverage for everybody in the country. It's still okay, it's working somehow, but I mean, I'm an extensive traveler myself. I've been countries where coverage was better than in Germany, so maybe we're not the absolute. Nevertheless, there's needed, in not in the case of the Ukraine, but all kinds of countries in the process of deployment of 5G technology, because there are a few common principles that need to be followed, and in the case of what we're talking about today, here aspects of routes and how to organize that, there's a few things that you need to look at. I understand that Ukraine is passed already the first 5G license auction, and there's a possibility that there may be more to come, but for the time being, that's the only one that has been necessary for the allocation of frequencies in the different bands that are to be the base for the 5G deployment. That was in 2019 here in Germany. Yeah, almost 3 years ago, no, 2.5 years ago. Is my understanding of the not only Ukrainian market is when it comes to mobile coverage in the regional extension, and especially on the coverage alongside of the big transport routes, the important ones, the autobahn type of highways, railroads, and all other main traffic lines, is that there's very little incentive to mobile network operators to do that on their own behalf, because it's not very economical. So making this profitable is probably not very easy. Coverage in Ukraine, as I was told, is often limited to cities and other agglomerations, and the use on trains, for example, is then limited to the few seconds that passengers pass through those agglomerations. And in the countryside, the coverage isn't as good as that because the operators don't see the necessity to do this. this is something that cannot be tolerated, of course, from a political point of view, but also for I mean, service quality and extension is something that requires more effort there. And the question is, what do you need to do to achieve this? If the operators aren't willing to do this on their own grounds, to put the equipment in places where the connection will be used more than just a few seconds per day only, and disregard everything else is nothing that governmental institutions and the general public can tolerate. So what Germany and many other countries, by the way, have done, Austria is an example that springs to mind, they've done this only last year, I think, is to set the requirements for mobile coverage in specific regions, and particularly alongside the transportation routes, as requirements in the allocation of frequencies to the operators. In the German case and in Austria as well, this was part of the auctions. That for a number of years, this requirement of seamless connectivity, uninterrupted phone service along transportation routes has been part of those requirements set forth in the mechanisms for the frequency allocations, by stipulating what operators have to do within a certain time frame after they've been accorded those frequencies. Now, the first auction to do that on a general level, I mean, the regional coverage was the one in 2010. The very first auction for UMTS frequencies didn't have a regional coverage requirement at all. That was in the year 2000, that legendary 60 billion allotment that was the most successful auction that I think any country ever had, when it gave away the frequencies for mobile operations, regardless of whether that was economically viable or not. This is what they did back then, but they did not have any requirements set forth in the frequency allocation at all. So 2010 was the first one. They only had regional coverages for parts of the country, but nothing specific to traffic or transportation infrastructure. That was the first one. There was in 2015, the 4G auction. That required 50 megabits per second for every antenna sector. Antenna sector being one of the one or many sectors on a cell site. If one tower can have more than one sector, so the requirement would be more than 50 megabits for a tower, but it could be up to, well, depending on the area, 3 antenna sectors. For a rural community is typical, for example. So you need 150 on that site. 150 megabits, and they also had the emphasis on coverage alongside traffic routes, including the railway system, back in 2015. Those requirements had to be met by the end of 2019, and as deadlines described by science fiction author Douglas Adams, as many of you might know who read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He's always liked deadlines because he loves the whooshing sound they make as they fly by, which is exactly what happened in the case of the frequency allocation in the 2015 auction. By the end of 2019, the Bundesnetzagentur, so the national regulator, realized in a report that very little of that had been promised by the operators had actually been fulfilled. This is going on. This has, even though the deadline had then been extended to 2020, none of the 3 major network operators, or the ones who had successfully participated in the auction, Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, Telefonica, had actually met the requirements by the end of that deadline. So the extension to end of 2020 went by without, again, fulfilling the requirements fully. And now, since summer this year, we're discussing hefty fines that the Bundesnetzagentur is discussing internally now, and there will probably be a punitive measure towards the operators because they didn't actually have everything in place that they needed. The estimation was by the BNetzA, the Bundesnetzagentur, that they need an additional 550 cell sites, so these cellular base stations to fulfill the requirement. That's not a lot if you compare it to the I don't know, 36,000 base stations that are operated by Deutsche Telekom alone currently. But the gaps are there, and you can measure them. One of the activities of our company, the Atene KOM, is actually to drive around the country and check where the coverage is in place, where it's lacking, the type of service quality that you get in areas. That's one of the things we do, and there are gaps. So let me tell you that this is pretty clear. As far as the traffic network is concerned, even the rules allow for lower service quality, actually. And if you look at that not having been met already, you'll understand why people are not very happy with the current situation. There's a deduction clause in the requirements in the auction rules that says if one of the operators is present in a location, the requirement is fulfilled regardless of the competition being absent. So if you look at that and say it would be sufficient if just one of the operators would be there, and even under those conditions you're not entirely there, that shows you how the discussion about the fines now has started to come along. So in theory, we should be there already. We're now looking at the rules that have been introduced with the 2019 auctions of the first 5G auction. Those rules are much more specific. They actually tell you exactly what to do and where to do it. The coverage of all main railway connections has to be 100 megabits per second by the end of 2022. And 50 megabits along all other railway tracks by 2024. That's what it says in the auction rules. And those other railway tracks are connections that are, less traveled than the main one. The mobile telecommunication services by Deutsche Telekom alone, they have a forecast of what they're going to do is that out of the railway systems, we have about 33,400 kilometers. Out of those, 7,800 are in the main category. That's the one where the ICE and the IC rapid train service are on. So coverage along those tracks will be 200 megabit by the end of 2024. That's what the commitment of the Deutsche Telekom says. And an additional 13,800 kilometers will be provided with 2000 and with the same speed or bandwidth by the end of 2025. Those 13,800 are all lines that have more than 2,000 passengers a day, so still heavy traffic. And the remaining 11,800 kilometers with not so much traffic on will follow with what Telecom says is more than 100 megabit per second by the end of 2026. This 100 megabit, 200 megabit doesn't tell you much because, I mean, we're talking about cellular services here, and those are shared services, of course. And we'll look at the implication that has in many other circumstances. We'll only cover it very briefly today here, but this is still something that is not entirely well, easily done. Now, this all remains to be seen yet, how good they will be in fulfilling the requirements, and but there are actual technical requirements for service deployment, and we'll have to look at what will be needed to meet those. I understand that the Ukrainian railway operator is now entering in this 5G game on their own account, as we have been consulting Deutsche Bahn for many years now, and on different aspects. I know that this is an involvement that tends to get very heavily and of course technologically oriented, challenging, and you're very welcome to join whatever will be needed there in terms of future development, of which there is a lot. Now, for the operators, once you have received in an auction your frequency allocations, and let's say you have participated in an auction where you've accepted the ground rules for minimum mobile phone network coverage that came with it, there isn't much, how should I say, leeway for you when it comes to realizing that coverage, because some of the technology actually takes the decisions for you, which requirements you have to actually fulfill. There are, I mean, even for the most confident and ambitious operators, it's very difficult to bend the basic laws of physics. That is true for neither the network operators nor the train systems. You will have to conform to a lot of things that are necessary there. And first and foremost, for those, I mean, what you need is fiber optic infrastructure. There's no way that you can get 5G services coverage in an area that's as large as the Ukraine in total, without deploying fiber optic infrastructure along the railroads, along every other aspect of the country, of course, but provisioning the cell sites with fiber optic cables is an absolute prerequisite for this. I could go into details about what the requirements there are. I will not do this because we're limited in time here. But let's just say if you have a trunk, a cable that provides capacity to a chain of 20 5G cell towers, for example, you need a number of at least 40 individual fibers in that cable, and you need a backhaul to get the connectivity to those towers on that trunk, anywhere between 25 and 100 gigabit to meet the TSN standard, the 802.1q. That is a lot to bring in there. So this is the absolute base requirement that you need to get going there. And then you'll realize that quickly that there's very, very little to be done to actually provide those services from the towers that you set up with the backhaul that they have to the actual travelers on the trains, because there's a few limitations there that will make it very difficult for the individual operator to do that. Without the involvement of the railway companies themselves, you can't actually do anything there, because first of all, you need to see a train as a Faraday cage. And that's not because it's a metal structure. I mean, it has windows, but those windows have a problem. The penetration loss from those typically metallicized windows, they have these coated layers of metal for heat insulation and ultraviolet protection, so to prevent it from getting sunny inside the car. The loss of to the signal can be as up to 35 or 30 or 35 dB, which basically prevents service from happening if the base stations are too wide apart. Deutsche Bahn, for example, is currently putting 30 new ICE3 train models in service because they've realized that this is a major issue with new windows, and those windows are coated with a metal layer that has a special grid structure for high frequency permeability. A special grid structure being applied with lasers, so this actually lets the signal get through. On top of that, along railroads, I don't know if the topology or topography in Ukraine, and especially for the railroads, has this problem. But in Germany, in the southern parts, there's a large portion of the tracks being in tunnels. How do you distribute a signal in a tunnel? That's usually done by a so-called leaky cables, so radiating coax cables that are needed to be deployed in there. Outside the tunnels, you need other means of getting the signal onto the trains. And one system used is distributed antenna systems that are actually there for shared service. So more than one mobile operator can use those and go on the train by using these DAS systems. The Bundesnetzagentur, the regulator, is actually acting as an umpire in negotiations between the market players in the network operation market. One of the rules in the 2019 auctions was that they have to cooperate and use infrastructure together if they want to provide their services. And so it's legally it's the regulator who steps in there to make this happen. In fact, it's the Deutsche Bahn itself who does this. They have initiated a program called the Master Plan Connectivity Rail that defines their own efforts at supporting mobile operators with the fulfillment of network coverage requirements. It has Deutsche Bahn owns about 20,000 kilometers of their own fiber optic infrastructure. And they have set up a company for last year, the year before last year, 2019. By the end of 2019, they set up a daughter company called DB Broadband that is actually responsible for services on this infrastructure. They're going to enlarge it a little more, but basically on the existing infrastructure, they already have services to mobile operators, but also to others who need connectivity in the country. As you can imagine, 20,000 kilometers compared to the entire network is about 2/3 of the length of the railway tracks that they have. But those 20,000 kilometers can be very useful if you want to transport connectivity over larger distances. And it is being used, of course, for providing connectivity to rural areas as well. Now, they've started cooperating with mobile companies with their own infrastructure, and also by providing the technologies to be able to use 5G on the trains. So this is ongoing, and they also expect to be having set this up by the end of 2026, which is the estimations of the mobile operators as well. And there's basically this master plan that makes sure that Deutsche Bahn does everything in their power to do this. So this is more or less what I have time to tell you, I believe. Lilia, I could go on for a long time here, but this is mostly what you expected from me, I suppose.
Have we got any questions? Do our colleagues from the railways have questions? Or maybe representatives of other mobile operators, because we have them with us today. If no, then we will let Ulrich go. No, we have a question. Our colleague, member of the Association for digital technologies. And I have a question to you, Mr. Ulrich. What has been the most successful project of public-private partnership, which in 5G rollout area? I mean, along the railroad or maybe motorcar roads that you can think of. Thank you.
I'm not the right person to answer that question, I'm afraid. I'm not involved in any of the purely economical aspects of this. I mean, I'm an information security specialist, so on a very limited area of 5G are my talking points. Public-private partnership is a very general term, and it also applies to, of course, the cooperation between the almost state-owned railway company and privately owned mobile operators, of course. So I think that the regulatory framework that has been set up for the frequency allocation is an example of how you rule through PPPs and make sure that they actually work on a basis that provides the framework for the success of it. I mean, infrastructure is something that is predominantly being done with public-private partnerships because the investment sums are so high. But let's not forget, it is a requirement that the state has to fulfill. Infrastructure is something that needs to be provided by the country, and it helps itself by setting up public-private partnerships. But the goal is still the fulfillment of the necessities for the population.
What were the problems that were there in the process of rollout of mobile networks along the Deutsche Bahn, and what were the most challenging problems? What are the biggest problems, in fact?
Now, there's depending on who you listen to, there's different explanations for this. The network operators themselves often claim that they have very much difficulties in finding spots to set up the actual buildings, the cell towers. So areas where they can rent a spot to set this up are scarce, and especially in rural areas, not easy to find. They need to get everything else in place as well. If you set up a cell tower somewhere in a wooden in an area that's mainly forest, how do you get electricity there? That's I mean, you not only need connectivity, you need electric power, and so that's the most frequent argument that they use why they haven't met the deadlines that had been set there. There's also a number of bureaucratic issues. If you look at that, I mean, usage of this may be subject to getting authorization to set up infrastructure. That in many cases has been too slow in being done. We're, as a company, we're also, I don't know if this has been said yet, but we're also very much involved in the infrastructure deployment for bringing typical cable-based bandwidth to households in Germany, not just 5G or 4G mobile networks, but mainly fiber optic connectivity to the homes. And we're responsible in place of the Ministry for Digital Infrastructure to authorize the funding for the state funding subsidies to the rollout projects, and very often there needs to be discussions with the railway operators. Every time you want to cross a railroad, that is actually much more a complex issue than you'd think. Since this is critical infrastructure, you can't just dig up a hole under the railway tracks and send the cable through. It is much easier if you have already bridges and tunnels in place that you can use for that. But if not, there's a long process of applying for those crossings, and this is something that had to be streamlined over the past 2 years, and it's an ongoing process. You need to talk to different people who have needs there, the communities on the one side, the network operators, the railway company, and getting that in place was more difficult than initially expected. And that's why it's taking so long. But we're in a time frame where things are sort of working out now, and looking at the prognostics that they have, the predictions are by the end of 2026, that's roughly 4 years from now, this should be sufficient to get everything in place that they need.
Herr Ulrich, a question. So you just mostly mention like the physical cybersecurity, you know, like how to limit the physical access to equipment. Did you also participate in implementation of cybersecurity measures, or is it was mostly about physical security to limit access to the equipment, and we basically just rely that the vendor of 5G just did everything right? So did you implement also some cybersecurity measures like monitoring all the endpoints or communication links? Was there any requirements to integrate it into the infrastructure?
Not on the level of the auction rules. There's nothing particular to cybersecurity was part of the regulations that were inside these the conditions that were set up in the auctions. Neither in 2015 nor 2019. I don't see that happening anytime soon either, because that's not an infrastructure topic. That is one that has been separately regulated. And we spoke about that last week. There was the conference where we said that where we talked about regulation for 5G security and the different aspects that you need to look at if you want to comply with those. But that is completely different and has nothing to do with the actual the railway systems in this case, and the frequency allocation is something that you can use to demand of operators to invest in rural areas where they wouldn't under normal circumstances, but cybersecurity needs to be regulated outside of the framework. We've talked about the the Information Security Act that was passed just last year in Germany, and that has all the major rules for security in the 5G deployment as well, basically saying we need proof of trustworthiness by the suppliers of equipment to be able to consider their equipment in the deployment of the networks. That's the main base rule for that. But I assure you, some of the most fascinating literature that you can get your hands on at the moment is security on the network level itself. Regardless of the equipment being used, if you have Chinese or Scandinavian suppliers, it doesn't change much. If you look at the network technology itself, which is very much target for threats and needs to be looked at very thoroughly. I've read this just a month ago, the BSI, the the German cybersecurity agency, the Federal Office for Information Security here in Germany, the central cybersecurity agency, has published a report on 5G internal network security. That is 80 pages alone. I haven't read it quite yet, but it's fascinating, and there's a lot to be looked at.
I have one more question. Did you implement 5G in the industrial environment, as part of the industry 4.0? Did you ever implement a private cells for the industrial environments?
No actual implementations. No, we've been consulting on many levels on that as well, including frequency allocations on individual non-network operators. The last auction in 2019 had a special aspect that provided frequency allocations to regionally limited or local operators. For example, companies who'd provide this only on their own grounds or campuses for universities, where they'd have their own 5G network, and that of course had industrial applications and other communication technologies inside, but we've never implemented any of those. This is not, we're a consultancy business and not in the actual deployment.
Дякуємо, Ульрих. Будемо вас відпускати, тому що...
Thank you, Ulrich. We have another speaker already asking us to let him go, to let him in. We are going really dynamic here. We're going to wait for you next time, maybe in March. We will prepare a list of questions in
My pleasure.
advance.
If it can be of any use, I'll be there.
Дуже рада нашій співпраці і дякую.
Yes, we are very happy with our cooperation. Thank you.